Hi guys, I'm finally getting round to filming a very requested video, and it's all about airbrushing. Now I have to add, this video is going to be encompassing all the basics of airbrushing. It'll be very difficult to actually film all the complexities of airbrushing and all the facets of airbrushing in just one video. I hope by the end of this video it's actually given people an idea of what it's like to airbrush, especially if you've never thought about picking up one before. So, let's get started, shall we? I have the compressor plugged in at the wall outlet, but I've not actually switched it on yet. So as soon as I actually switch on the compressor, the needle that's at 0 now will start to shoot up. And as you can see, straight up to 40 psi. This is a very well made compressor and it actually fills up very quickly. Now 40 psi is a little bit too high for what I want to do, so I need to drop down that pressure to 20 psi. So I'm going to show you how I go about doing that. So first of all, I'm depressing the trigger on the airbrush, and as I'm doing that, I'm turning the dial around to get the airbrush to about 20 psi, and that's the pressure that I want to be working at today. The airbrush is actually sitting in an airbrush cleaning pot. This is pretty much an essential purchase, to be honest guys. Every time that you actually need to remove excess paint in the airbrush cup between paint changes, you need somewhere to spray it, and an airbrush cleaning pot does exactly what it says on the tin. Now, this one's a really well made one. It comes with oversized filters, and those filters are really important. They're going to help eliminate some of those harmful fumes, especially when you're using the cleaning solutions coming out of that airbrush cleaning pot there, and that was me just showing you that. So getting an airbrush cleaning pot when you actually buy your compressor and airbrush is a very good idea, guys. So it's time to put paint straight into the airbrush cup now, and I'm starting off using Comarch colours by Madeira Awata. These paints are already pre-thinned and they're made specifically to be sprayed out of an airbrush, which is fantastic. They also have an agitator in the bottle, so as you're shaking it up, you know that all the pigments are going to be mixed nice and evenly throughout the paint. I'm only going to be placing a few drops of paint in the airbrush because using airbrush paint, it's really efficient. You generally, unless you're painting very large objects, don't need much paint, and it can go quite a far way. Right, we're on to the fun part now guys, actually spraying paint out of the airbrush. I'm going to try and explain as easily as I can the process in doing that. So the first thing we need to be doing is actually pressing down on the trigger to release air. Then after actually pressing down on the trigger, we actually pull the trigger or the lever backwards. The more I pull back on the lever as I depress the trigger, the more paint will come out. Also, the further away I bring the airbrush from my object that I'm painting at, in this case it's paper, the wider the spray paint pattern will be. But as you can see here, I'm ever so slightly pulling back on the airbrush and I'm getting very close, and I'm able to get very fine accurate lines with this particular airbrush. Also, this airbrush has a paint limiter system, and by turning the dial here I'm able to limit the amount of paint that's actually going to travel out of the airbrush, and I can actually get it to a specific line weight and it will paint the same thickness every single time. So as you see, as I'm turning the dial there, it's getting much closer to that needle locking nut. So as I actually pull back on the trigger, it's going to limit the amount of paint that comes out. So here it's actually engaged and I can only pull back on that trigger a certain amount, and it's going to give me consistent line weights. So spraying closely, nice fine line, and spraying a little further away, a smoother, wider paint pattern. I'd strongly recommend that if you're new to airbrushing, that you always keep on the needle cap. The only time that I'd recommend removing the needle cap is when you're trying to spray a really wide spray pattern and you might get excess paint on the actual needle protector there, or in this case the crown cap. So let's put some of those things into practice now. I'm going to actually start by putting down some tight thin line weights. I'm just going to doodle any random picture just quickly. So I'm only pulling back on the trigger or the airbrush lever there ever so slightly, and I'm working in close proximity to the paper. I also have to add, guys, that I know I'm working on paper and I'm sure you want to see me working on a model, but to actually show you how things work, it's much easier to do it this way. In future I will actually be showing you start to finish how to paint a model, but for this video I think this is probably the easiest way to show you. I have to add as well, guys, that actually airbrushing in front of a camera is not the easiest job in the world, so if things seem a bit skew, I apologise. You might not actually see on the trigger there, but my finger is pulling the trigger back ever so slightly. Here you can see that I've actually changed the way that I'm painting. I'm bringing the airbrush further away from the paper, and I'm also pulling the trigger back ever so slightly more. And it's to create a different effect, and that's how when I'm painting my miniatures that I'm able to get blending, because with that type of spray pattern each colour can blend into the next seamlessly and smoothly. This is a lesson on what not to do, guys. I'm showing you here that by really blasting paint straight back after leaving the paint settle for a while, you can get sometimes little splashes of paint come out. And also, going back to what I said earlier about the needle cap, if you're actually spraying really wide spray patterns, you'll get the paint come up all around that needle cap. So there you go, guys. By doing this video you forced me to clean my needle cap, and it's your fault. I know I've probably said this quite a few times now in this video, but I have to reiterate, you can get many effects with the airbrush, but it's all in accordance with how far you pull that trigger back and how close or how far away you are to your source object. It's time to actually clean out our airbrush now. So if you've actually finished with the colour that you're using, or that there's no paint left in the cup and you finish, it's time to actually start cleaning out the airbrush. You can see that there's paint up the side of the wall as well. I strongly recommend using an airbrush cleaner when you're actually cleaning your airbrush. They're designed in a way to make sure that it helps easily get rid of excess paint and residual paint particles that are actually in your airbrush that water's just obviously not going to do. What I actually like to do with this airbrush cleaner is actually cut it 50-50 with water. It's so concentrated, but even diluting it, it's still going to work well and it's going to last longer. I also like using a stiff brush to actually clean around the walls to make sure that the paint doesn't dry and leave it a much more difficult job at a later date to clean the airbrush. So the key, to be honest, guys, is to make sure you keep on top of cleaning your airbrush. So between each individual paint change, rather than putting the paint straight into the cup for the next colour, you want to clean it between each one. And what you'll see me doing now is actually decanting all of that airbrush cleaner straight into the airbrush cleaning pot. The important thing to do is to keep spraying your cleaner or water straight through the airbrush until you actually see no more paint residue and you actually see clean airbrush solution or clean water. I normally mix it up and use water and the airbrush cleaning solution. Again, it's to make that airbrush cleaning solution last longer really. A lot of hobbyists, especially if you're new to airbrushing, won't actually have specific airbrush colours. You might have regular acrylic colours. Well, here I'm using live colour acrylic colours, and the simple answer is they cannot be sprayed directly out of your airbrush unless you thin them. Live colour does an excellent acrylic thinner that enables you to actually spray the paint out of the airbrush smoothly. I'm going to show you how I go about thinning down the paint so it can actually be sprayed out of the airbrush effectively. I have to add that the live colour paints are absolutely beautiful. I've actually used them before, and I will be doing future videos actually showing you what they're actually like to work with a regular brush. But for now we're going to be thinning them. I actually have decanted some of that acrylic thinner from live colour into a handy dropper bottle. It's going to make it easier for me to actually thin the paints down by controlling how many drops come out, because as you can see it's quite a wide bottle top on the acrylic thinner there. There's quite a few ways that you can actually thin the paints. Some people actually thin the paints in the cup, which I do myself from time to time. I would strongly recommend that you don't actually thin the paint in the cup, especially if you're starting out. It's nice to actually get a feel for the actual ratio of airbrush thinner or acrylic thinner to the actual paint that you need to thin down. So if you can actually see the consistency in a palette or in a little thimble that you can transfer to the paint cup, you'll actually know in future how thin it is. So the first thing, I'm actually just shaking it up, making sure that all the paints mixed thoroughly in the pot. What I like to actually do to actually take the paint out is use the back of a clean brush and I'm going to place it in the palette there. This paint is lovely and smooth straight out the pot, but it's still not thin enough to go out smoothly of the airbrush. So putting in a couple of drops of the live colour acrylic thinner is going to help thin that out nicely. The consistency that we're looking for, you may have heard this in other airbrushing videos, is sort of like milk. But basically you want the paint to be very, very runny. But there's no exact science. Different paints have got different viscosities and different thicknesses. So one paint might need 2 drops of thinner and another paint might need 3 drops of thinner. The rule of thumb is thin it enough until it's actually working nicely out of your airbrush, and if it's not, add a bit more thinner. This is not the quickest method, I may add, to actually putting the paint into your cup. You would actually want to use a pipette, which I do have, but unfortunately I didn't have it to hand while I was filming this video. So we're going to be spraying out our regular acrylic paint now. And we'll see how it's going to come out. There you go, nice and smooth, no paint spatters or splodging. And that is a regular acrylic paint that was just thinned using acrylic thinner. what I was trying to do is get some really fine lines there, and the airbrush seemed to be struggling a little. So I've thinned it down a little bit more, which goes back to what I said a moment ago. If it's not working just right, add a little bit more thinner. And we're away. Unfortunately, I've not been able to show everything in this video, to be quite honest. I've not shown you the intricacies of the Mac valve on this airbrush, and I've also only touched briefly on painting with an airbrush. But I think, and I hope, that this has given a good insight into how fun it can be actually to use an airbrush, and also I've said it at least 2 or 3 times in this video, to stop people being scared to use an airbrush. They're fairly straightforward tools, and they really can help every hobbyist out there improve on the miniatures that they do. I'll be honest, and I'll make a bold and sweeping statement here, guys. If you're painting a tank with a brush, no matter how good of a paint you are, the next person with an airbrush will be able to paint that tank to a much higher standard. The paint will come out smoother, it will flow better, and you'll be able to get much better seamless paint blends. An airbrush will never replace your paintbrush, guys, but the key factor is they're there to help us achieve things in the hobby that were very difficult to do with a brush. For example, painting a large vehicle or a terrain with a brush is very time consuming, and if you're trying to get a really high finish with colour blending, it's very difficult with a brush. Whereas the airbrush, it makes life so much easier, and it's fun to do. Please check the description box below as well, guys. I've put links for all the products that I've used in this video. I hope that there's other people out there watching this video that have actually just been given that little push and that little urge to actually start airbrushing. I'll be honest, guys, if it wasn't for YouTube and actually watching great YouTubers out there, that I wouldn't actually be using an airbrush myself. So it gives me great pleasure knowing that hopefully by uploading this video, other people are actually going to join me on the journey. And speaking of the journey, there will be more airbrush videos in future, guys. Me actually painting a model. I'm sure that's what you'd like to see next. So if you like this video, guys, please hit the like button, and also don't forget to subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next one.